very last session, and I'm thrilled we have three very distinguished democratic theorists who've worked in bringing different aspects of democratic theory to the table. It's also our final session, so I will try to keep it short. So I'm sure so we can have a more general discussion and some reflection on the wonderful 2 days of panels and conversations. But before starting off, I just want to quickly, again, because I know we all want to do it, is first thank David Frumkin and Mie Inoue again for their wonderful work. And of course, also to thank Hélène Landemore and Shayla Ben for and finally, all of the wonderful papers who have been provocative and interesting, and again, we'll continue that. So our three speakers in our final session, and I'll introduce them very quickly and in the order they will speak. For our first speaker will be Archon Fung, who I think from the Kennedy School and has been working for years and will really, I think, in the paper and in his larger project has taught us so much about participatory democracy, democracy from below, and different forms of collective agency. So that will be the first speaker. Next will be John Keane, who's written more books on democracy than I can mention, from Sydney, and bigger books on democracy. Yeah. And so we will say the title of this panel is a global democracy in the global age, and John, I think, more than anyone, has been thinking of democracy globally. And finally, we'll end, as we ought to, with Hélène Landemore, who has been working in the tradition of epistemic democracy, but really bringing that conversation to many other ways of thinking and thinking about democracy, and especially in a conversation about deliberation, and now her a provocative new project on open democracy, which we'll hear more about. So without further ado.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So this is a kind of unusual project for an audience like this. This is a piece of social theory that I developed in conjunction with some social movement leaders in the service of social movements, trying to help them think more clearly about movement strategy. And so this is a talk on power and a way to think about power. I reckon power kind of in the way that Raoul does, at the very capillary level. Power is whether someone is able to get what they want to do. So Larry's dining mates at Aspen have a lot of power. They were able to get to Aspen, hear a bunch of wonderful talks, engage with Larry. So they have a lot of power. Other people in housing projects trying to stay in their house have very little power. Just to set these comments in light of some of the discussions so far, I think as democratic theorists and political scientists, we're used to thinking about formal political institutions, and formal political institutions allow us to take political equality a little bit for granted, at least formally. But we all know that the picture is a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of ways to draw this picture, and we've talked about some of these other regions over the last day and a half. I will focus on individuals and intermediary organizations and a little bit on legislation and outcomes, with the idea that real substantive political equality is heavily dependent on the strength and the character of intermediary organizations, which haven't really come up in the discussion much at all, right? But I think that substantive political equality, especially now in America, is extremely dependent on the character of those organizations. People often experience power or powerlessness in confronting organizations at school, their company, the government. But organizations are also a principal method for people to articulate their interests and to exercise power. So how should organizations build and use power? I offer this framework as a contrast to some other theories of power, and I won't kind of get into the whole different theories of power. This is a contrast primarily to Luke's and Gaventa, the three phases of power, and this is kind of urging people to think about power in 4 different levels, and the purpose is fundamentally different. As Steve Lukes wrote in his new introduction to power, their project was mainly to explain why people are subordinated and dominated. And it's about asymmetric power to explain subordination. This is a framework of power to enable liberation. And so everyday power is is at the retail level. Can a person get and keep a job? Can a woman stay at work and have her career flourish without being sexually harassed? Those are questions of everyday power, and ultimately I think that is the measure that we should focus on. But it's hard to focus on that. The kind of power that we've largely been talking about at this meeting, that most social movements organizations focus on, is policy power. These are covering laws and policies that affect whole classes of people. So immigrant rights activists were very happy when Janet Napolitano in 2002 issued the DACA memorandum for deferred action for childhood arrivals, right? That was a covering law or not even a law, a covering executive order that allowed lots of immigrants to stay in the country with some security, at least for a little while. The Fight for 15 is another struggle at the second level of power to get people a $15 an hour wage in cities all over the United States. Covering laws and policies don't always have to come from the government. When Walmart Corporation passes domestic law partner benefits, 1 million people benefit from that covering policy. They're able to do things and have a quality of life that they weren't before. The main focus of my remarks is about structural power. And most of the ways that we talk about structural power are about big structures, like Jacob Hacker mentioned Charles Lindblom earlier. His idea, the punishing recoil mechanism of capital, is a big structure that we can't easily affect. However, I think in some ways, Ian's discussion yesterday about proportional representation and two-party systems, also about big structures which are not that easy to affect. Right? I want to talk about middle-level structures, structural power, which organizations can affect. Structural power is about the tilt of the playing field. So if you're playing soccer that way, it's going to be a little bit harder for you to score a goal. Sometimes you'll be able to do it, but it's going to be a lot harder to play going that way. How do we translate this idea of the tilt of the playing field into democratic politics? One clear example is gerrymandering. So in North Carolina, there are 13 congressional districts. In 2008, the Democrats won 54% and got 8 seats. The Republicans, 45% of the popular, and got 5 seats. 2011, Republicans controlled a majority of the state legislature, redistricted the hell out of it. And in 2012, Democrats got 51% of the popular vote, actually the majority. They got 4 seats. Republicans got 49%, got 9 congressional seats. That is one way to tilt the playing field. I want to say for a bunch of organizations out there, there are 5 forms of structural power of tilting the playing field that people ought to think about. Money, members, leverage, information, and allies. Money, obviously, is important. Some of you may have noticed in the recent tax reform that was passed, selective universities, about 50 of them, face an endowment tax of 1.4% on universities with endowments of more than $500,000 per student, right? I think it's no coincidence that the politics of those universities tilt significantly against this administration, right? The Crimson, my student paper here at my university, this is a study from 2011 to 2014, 84% of campaign contributions made by a group of 614 faculty, 84% went to Democratic candidates, right? And somebody was mentioning that seems actually low by their expectation. I seriously doubt that Yale is much different from that, right? If Steve Bannon and Donald Trump had the courage of their convictions in passing the tax reforms and really wanted to eviscerate a big part of the progressive civil society movements, they would have just eliminated the 501c3 contribution. I think in my life, both in higher ed and my political life, I don't actually know anyone who's not dependent at some level removed from a large philanthropist who gets big tax breaks out of the tax code, right? A bunch of that would have come to a screaming halt, right, if somebody yanked the 501c3 tax deduction. Citizens United, there are people in this room, Larry, who've forgotten more about this than I will ever know, just that it opens a lot of money in politics. There are a lot of other laws and public policies that channel money to civil society organizations. One that is in some jeopardy is a rule called labor union agency fees that require people who aren't in unions and workplaces represented by unions never to get less give those unions money because those unions are providing the service of collective bargaining and representation for them, right? There is an effort afoot to eliminate this, to rule it illegal, unconstitutional, right? And that would be a measure that yanks a lot of money away from trade unions, one important kind of civil society organization. Second form of structural power, members. Again, labor union example, card check certification for union votes is an important form of structural power. If this is part of union elections, it's much easier for unions to be able to form. I had a fascinating conversation a couple of years ago with a former head of the National Rifle Association. And he was telling me the story that one of the most important fights that they fought was that there was a rule that was going to prevent minors from shooting on shooting ranges in national parks. I said, why is that important for you? That's not taking away your guns. That's not doing anything. Why do you care about that? And he said, look, this is kind of a Larry point. These days we have Xbox, we have social media, and so if a kid doesn't learn to love guns and shooting guns by the time they're 9 or 10, we've lost them. They're never going to be an NRA member. And I thought, man, this guy knows what he's talking about. Okay, leverage. Leverage is about rules and public policies that give people a seat at the table. Isabel's paper on bicameralism in companies is a proposal for creating some additional leverage for workers, although she didn't talk about worker organizations. The Wagner Act is probably the most important instance of this in maybe U.S. history, certainly U.S. labor law. When the Wagner Act passed, there were a little less than 5 million union members in the United States, and a couple decades later, there were 15 million. Part of that was because what the Wagner Act does is that it requires collective bargaining if workers form a recognized bargaining unit. And I'll go quickly. Information. Information can provide important hooks for community organizations. Redlining data was instrumental for community organizations in Chicago and other large cities to target banks who are denying people home loans. But it can also work the other way. A few months ago, ICE started issuing monthly reports about local jurisdictions that were not complying with orders to turn over detainees. Allies, I'll go quickly over that one. Public policies can structure important alliances. The most discussed one is the military-industrial complex. On the left, there's also a social welfare complex that operates analogously. And if you are part of this kind of complex, your civil society organization is much stronger than it would otherwise be. Okay, I'm almost done. Strategic choices. So organizations can't do everything at once. Which level of power should you operate at? Say the only thing you cared about was the welfare of low-income workers, and you only had enough resources to pursue one strategy, a minimum wage or the right to organize. Which would you pursue? Many people would pursue the public policy, level 2 power, level 3 power. Many people would pursue level 2 power, a minimum wage, maybe a universal basic income. For me, it's the right to organize every single time. Why? Because I don't know which public policy is ultimately going to be good for workers, but if workers are organized, they will figure it out. This is a chart that depicts union density in OECD countries. On the x-axis, in inequality measured by the share of income of the top 20% to the bottom 20% in 2013. As you can see, the regression line is sharply downward. The interesting thing about this figure is there are 4 quadrants. Highly unionized countries where there's low inequality. Not very organized countries where there's high inequality. This region here, you can get to low inequality without high union density. There are some idiosyncratic paths. But the really interesting thing is the empty quadrant. In 2013, there were no mature industrialized countries with high inequality and lots of labor unions. It's kind of an impossibility thesis, right? And that's because they exercise a lot of political power. Okay, narrative power, and this is much more to Diana's. I don't really know how narrative power is generated, but I do feel it's very important. This is a graph about opinions on gay marriage, the percentage of adults who favor or oppose same-sex marriage. It crosses about 2012 that change in the public narrative creates has larger impacts for both efforts to secure covering policies and everyday retail politics for gay and lesbian, transgender people all across America. Okay, I want you to do an experiment. Everyone say, government is good right now. Say it with me. Government is good. I bet a lot of people couldn't even say it. And for some people who said it, I bet you felt a twinge of discomfort when you said it. And that's because you have been subject to many decades of ideology that Reagan didn't start this, but it was certainly an inflection point, teaching us that government is not the solution to your problems, but government is the problem. That is part of the narrative structure and background of the politics that we play on now, and that creates a strong tilt in the playing field for people who would like to use government power to do things. Public trust in government, you know these statistics. So last slide. Some lessons. Organizations now largely focus on policy at level 2. They're very good at organizing campaigns to win covering policies in environment, for poor people, whatever. But levels 3 and 4 are critical for sustained success, and social movement organizations and mass people's organizations outside of the labor movement don't really have the muscles to develop and fight for power at level 3 and level 4. And maybe that's because they require a lot of deferred gratification. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is...
Thank you very much, Karuna. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming in. And I'm almost the last to say to Hélène and Shayla, thank you very, very much for the invitation and for what has been really a remarkable 2 days. I want to sow some seeds of ascension with a bit of wild thinking. In fact, I changed my topic entirely in the last 2 hours. So what you're going to get is rough and ready, but it is a response to a certain silence, I think, that descended on this gathering during the last 2 days. And I want to make 6 points. The first you have probably read in the program notes, which has to do with the conceptualization of crisis. There is, I think, Shayla put it very well in the opening session, a crisis is a process in time and space where there is a sense disequilibrium among actors and actors within institutions. And that disequilibrium can actually be enabling of new possibilities. It is a moment of judgment. There is a bad habit, as I pointed out in the first day, of thinking apocalyptically in eschatological terms about crises. I think there is also a bad habit of thinking that crises are gripping dramas, they are flashpoints, they're sudden turning points. As Gramsci called them, crises are catastrophic moments of disequilibrium. That's the sense of crisis that Engels expressed when writing to Marx in 1857, when he says, I'm just waiting for the next crisis because it will be as good as a swim in the ocean. That way of thinking, I think, neglects another source of crises that contemporary democracies are entangled within. This is what can be called smouldering crises, slow motion crises. That is, crises can obey the laws, so to say, of the longue durée. They may not express themselves as mayhem or convulsive fits and start. They have a slow motion quality, and I want to illustrate this, secondly, by talking about the greening of politics. We've had some tangential discussion of this, but I think it deserves much more, because I have in a forthcoming book called Power and Humility that Cambridge are publishing, which is about the future of democracy. It's the sequel to my history of democracy. I have a section where I'm very interested in and try to explain why this greening of politics is important for thinkers of democracy and, of course, citizens and representatives to think through and act upon. It's pretty clear, this is the second point, that there is a greening of politics going on globally. Pressing hard on corporations and governments and various mainstream public opinion. This greening of democracy, I think, runs far beyond public talk of sustainability and climate justice, or disputes about carbon emissions, trading schemes, and so on. In less than a generation, we've had a whole proliferation of civic initiatives, of new parties, and these have concerned themselves with matters like the future of nuclear power and chemical pollutants and carbon emissions and species destruction. There is, of course, a sense that, a rising sense that we humans are the first to occupy as a species the entire planet with potentially catastrophic consequences. This is the whole discussion about the Anthropocene. We know as well, as part of this greening of politics, that there are new philosophical perspectives. Think of critical animal studies or feminist care ethics, the resurgence of species of neo-Marxism, capability approaches, and talk of environmental justice. There are lots of tactical questions as well. For example, whether it's important to form a Green Party, or whether the primacy should be given to civic initiative, to civil disobedience, to what Greenpeace originally called mime bombs. You know, these moments of détournement where you cause trouble in particular contexts. These, I think, have broadened democratic policy agendas. It's pretty obvious. Third point is less obvious. The third point is that it seems to me that this post-1945 period that I have been trying to emphasize in the last couple of days as historically unique is a period in which the old subject of the right to vote is being reconsidered. It was Norberto Bobbio who famously said that the question now is no longer who votes, but where people vote. Actually, it seems to me that there are a couple of examples, and the greening of politics is one, where in fact the struggle to extend the franchise is going on. This is not a normal way of thinking about green politics, but I want to try to articulate this. What I want to say is that there are, in our generation, there has been, and this is unfinished business, the invention of a whole series of procedural mechanisms for extending rights of representation to the biomes in which we dwell. This, of course, at some initial level, is an absurdity. Nature, so to say, cannot speak for itself, it cannot organize, it cannot represent itself in human affairs. But these mechanisms of representation, this extension of the right to vote, is a form of fiduciary relationship. By that I mean that humans take it upon themselves in relation to biomes in which they dwell to take care prudently of the needs and the interests of non-human agents and principles. That is to say, there is the presumption that there is a problem, that biomes have an entitlement to appear to be represented, that is to say, in public affairs. And this understanding of a fiduciary relationship with the biomes, to speak abstractly, doesn't suppose that nature is a fixed given, as early modern conservators such as Maistre and Burke and Taine suppose. In fact, this new way of thinking supposes that nature is not a fixed entity, that it can actually be destroyed, that it has a history, that it is permanently in motion. And there is finally, I think, in this politics of representation, the struggle to extend the vote to biomes, there is no presumption that this will bring peace on Earth, as if there is some kind of earthly paradise awaiting us. I want to give some examples of this abstract principle. The most obvious is the birth of green parties. There's a struggle where I come from as to whether the New Zealanders did it first or the Australians did it first, but within a few months we invented green parties for very local and very interesting reasons. We have, I'll just run through the gamut of innovations that have happened since the roughly the end of the 1940s. Liquid democracy parties such as the Piraten in Sweden and Germany, The best party in Iceland, which, as you know, won the municipal elections for Reykjavik by proposing a polar bear for the zoo, plus free public transport and so on. There are lots of local government covenants. There are rewilding projects. There are environmental impact hearings and citizen science projects such as the BBC's Opal project. There are global agreements such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Aarhus Convention, which calls upon states to guarantee their citizens' rights of information and justice and participation in environmental decision-making. There are daring multimedia civic occupations. We had one at the University of Sydney, which I confess the Sydney Democracy Network, which I founded and had a hand in that we arranged for Greenpeace to come to campus and set up a fracking exercise outside the law faculty. It was so utterly realistic that it was designed actually to shift the university's divestment from carbon investments, and we actually won. It took a year, but we managed to do it. These things are normal. I better hurry. There are green think tanks. There are regional environmental protection initiatives, and interestingly, there is the constitutionalization of rights of biomes. For example, you can see this in the recent Slovene constitutional reform that everybody has the right to clean drinkable water, or that Bhutan and Mongolia have actually extended constitutional protection of biomes as a duty of citizens. I want to say, fifthly, and very, very quickly, something about the way that many of these experiments force a redefinition of territory and actually challenge the territorial mentality that Shayla was speaking about in her comment. These are not the only examples. If you look at the Tibetan government in exile, or if you look at a body like the Forestry Stewardship Council, or if you look at Al Jazeera Publics, they operate, so to say, as democratic phenomena beyond territorial boundaries. The very striking example in this field of green politics is what I've analysed as bio-democratic experiments. If you look at the way Uluru in Central Australia is governed, or if you look at the new Wanganui Treaty in New Zealand, or you look at the Haida Gwaii Islands of the People off the coast of British Columbia, what you will find is peoples, indigenous peoples, having the rights to their land, having a form of self-government that sees human beings as part of a much older and deeper process. Human beings who are dependent upon biomes, and where there is a fiduciary relationship expected, and where unborn generations are part of the present. This, I think, is very poorly analysed in the field of democratic theory, and I want finally to say one thing rudely about democracy itself. You know, it ought to be obvious, but nobody said it in the last 2 days, that I cannot think of a political form, a way of life, a spirit, a language, a set of institutions that is more anthropocentric than democracy. What could be more anthropocentric than the presumption that people, the people, are the masters and possessors of the nature in which they dwell, that they are the lords and ladies of the universe, that they are the sovereign power on earth. What I think is very interesting, philosophically and politically, about this greening of politics, and I've mentioned some of the tendencies, is that it forces, I think, a reimagining of what democracy is. We could say it means, normatively, a way of handling power in which human beings treat each other as equals and struggle for their equalization of life chances, but doing so within biomes upon which they depend and with which they should have a more equal relationship. That, I think, that reimagining of democracy never happened before in its history. It's unique to this historical period. It's unfinished business. It may, of course, all end very, very badly indeed. That's it. Thank you very much.
Our final speaker, Hélène.
There it is.
So let me start first by thanking everyone for this wonderful, inspiring presentations over the last 2 days. I'm already thinking of the ways I'm going to try to enrich this reflection that I'm going to propose to you now about open democracy. So I guess it's fitting that I'm the last presenter, and I wanted to take us back to this definition of democracy. What does democracy mean? And I want to argue, I guess, that we don't really know, and that it could mean and should mean so much more than what we're used to thinking about. So indeed, what does democracy mean for most of us today? For our empirical colleagues who presented yesterday, it means basically party competition, periodic elections, some form of majority rule, and that's kind of what it's supposed to be. But if we zoom back and away from the last 200 years or so, it used to mean something completely different. So the obvious case is 5th and 4th century BC Athens, where it involved neither elections nor party competition, nothing of the like. It involved being able to walk in the public space and basically be a part of a collective decision-making process, or the right to be chosen as a member, to be selected by lot as a member of the Council of 500 that determined the agenda for the People's Assembly. So yes, ancient Athens was very exclusionary, and I do hope that this is on contingent for contingent reasons rather than conceptual ones. But once you counted as a citizen, you were in, right? Power was open to you, was accessible to you. And so we're told today that, yes, sure, but this is a model that's unavailable to us because we live in mass commercial societies where there are too many of us and we're too busy pursuing commercial endeavors to really have the time for politics like that. And so we need to live in representative democracies, where we delegate authority to a subset of the polity. But somehow, the move to representation has also meant a move to closure. And today, parliaments are accessible only to a fraction of the population, people with the right connections, the right amount of money, the right accent, the right skin tone, etc., etc. And I don't know that this had to be the case. And in fact, if you go back to the debates of the 18th century that we're still living with to a degree, there were exclusionary principles built in that didn't necessarily have to be there. So famously, Madison contrasted ancient forms of government and modern representative democracies by the fact that they are meant to exclude the people in their collective capacity. So it's a remarkable statement, right? Similarly, that was paired with a view of representation as a filter. That's the sort of historic view that triumphed in the 18th century, or the mirror view that was put forward by the Federalists. And the idea was that we needed an elite few to basically refine and enlarge the raw opinion or uninformed or ignorant opinions of the masses. And I think it's no surprise that at the end of the 20th century, our dominant metaphors retain some of that exclusionary tinge. So if you look at Rawls' philosophy, where he equates public reason with basically the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. We have a group of 9 supreme judges, that are basically issuing counter-majoritarian decisions for the most part, in secluded contexts, etc. Even if you turn to Habermas, whom I consider myself like a follower in many respects, the central metaphor is that of the sluice, right? It's the connection between the two deliberative tracks, the formal one and the informal one. And the sluice is this gate that's supposed to filter and separate the two tracks as much as join them. So somehow the metaphor that we live with, that we live by, that inform our political theories, retain as inclusive as they try to be, they retain some of that separation and exclusionary nature. So if we go back to the 18th century, in fact, we see a number of roads that were never taken. And that's my effort in this new book project that I'm writing, to explore conceptually those other roads that were never taken. And what I'm offering is not really a blueprint. I'm not going to give you an institutional solution or the set of institutions you should implement to get to a better or truer or more genuine democracy, but I offer this as open democracy as a lens through which to identify more clearly the democratic deficit of our current representative institutions and perhaps envision something more ambitious or new or more authentically democratic in my view. So the book project is really trying to defend a paradigm of democracy that would take seriously the ideal of popular rule and recover the openness of earlier democratic practices while accepting at the same time the necessity and desirability of some form of representation, because I do not think that we can have direct democracy on a mass scale. And so this ideal of open democracy is a set of institutional principles, and by that I mean principles that are less abstract than values like justice, fairness, even equality, but more concrete than specific recommendations like multi-party system versus two-party system, or bicameralism versus unicameralism, etc. So I'm going to go over them relatively briefly. The first one, the sort of conditions of possibility for the whole thing, is actually what I call empowerment rights. By empowerment rights, I mean to define rights that are more than liberal rights. Liberal rights were historically defined as checks against power, trumps against power. They were meant to empower individuals against power. I mean to empower ordinary citizens in their access to power. So truly, these empowerment rights will include some of the classical liberal rights, including freedom of expression, etc., and a number of minority rights. They will also include the right to stand for participation in mini-publics, which are, I think, an important part of this new ideal. But also citizens' initiative, the right for citizens, when they gather enough signatures, to put a law directly to Parliament and have a right to have that law debated by Parliament, or else being given a counter-proposal to it. A right of referral, so when a law is not working for the people, they need to have a chance, again, by gathering enough signatures, that would be one way, to put that law to a referendum. So we don't get stuck with laws that are widely unpopular, or and you give a chance to the system to adjust and respond to people's preferences. The second central institutional principle is democratic deliberation. This is the central practice of what I see as a very attractive theory of democratic legitimacy developed in the 90s. So all of you are familiar with it, I'm quite confident. We can trace it back to Habermas, Joshua Cohen, Rawls also. And the idea is that laws and policies are only legitimate when they've been the result of an exchange of arguments and reasons amongst free and equal. And you would think that's what's at the heart of our current systems. In theory, that's the reconstruction offered by Habermas and people like Nadia Obinati, etc. The reality is that there's no deliberation in Parliament today in most of Western democracies. This is just posturing and party bargaining and compromises. The deliberation that happens, if it happens at all, is in private sort of committees out of sight. It doesn't really happen in the public sphere either. In fact, Diana Moose has shown how in our current system people don't talk across ideological divides. It's too costly, it's painful, it's emotionally very difficult. So it's not a centerpiece, and I think it should be. And there's a lot of discoveries we have to do about how this deliberation works in practice, and how it can be institutionalized, and that would be for future research. The third principle is the majoritarian principle. Again, it should seem obvious that the democracy should be based on some form of majority rule when deliberation fails to yield some kind of consensus or decision. And yet, most of our regimes are currently largely counter-majoritarian in spirit. I think Melissa Schwarzberg has done great work to show that and to suggest that we would be better off with more majoritarian structure. This could take the form of simple majority rule, replacing supermajority threshold with simple majority threshold, or majority judgment, a version of aggregation of ratings. I'm not going to go into the detail. Yes, some of you will be worried about the tyranny of the majority, but the reality is that our system also are empowering powerful minorities. Besides, I think we've underestimated systematically the internal democratic resources of a genuinely open, deliberative democracy, short of a majority thresholds. Fourth principle is what I call complex representation. It's basically any other selection mechanism than election that can claim democratic credentials. Because, like Arash, like a number of people, I believe that this idea that democratic legitimacy comes from consent, and consent at the ballot booth is largely an illusion. So we have to rethink our theories of democratic legitimacy. Example of non-electoral representation would be autocratic representation, the kind of representation that is at stake in all the mini-publics. We are very familiar with that work great and produce remarkable results. I'm not going to go into the details we heard from Yves yesterday. And I just want to point out that this is one of the roles not explored in the 18th century for purely ideological and technical reasons. So Yves 2 days ago was explaining how in the 18th century the anti-federalists, for example, who had this idea of a mirror image of the people, didn't have the technology or the conceptual tools to think of a selection mechanism for it, random sampling. And the theory of legitimacy based on consent also made that sort of road impossible to travel at the time. Another type of non-electoral representation that will have democratic credentials, in my view, is what I call crowdsourced representation. It's based on self-selection. It has its problems. I wouldn't necessarily give final say to people that self-select into processes, though participatory budgeting to work decently well. But that's another type. Another type would be electoral representation revisited. For example, Brian Ford and others have developed this model of delegative democracy that is now called liquid democracy and is used by the Pirate Party, for example, and other parties in Europe to, and it's a form of electoral democracy where you delegate your vote to whomever you want, so you're not stuck with the official candidates. The fifth principle, and I'm almost done, is rotation. I think we know power corrupts, and somehow we still haven't entrenched in our political principles the necessity to have much more turnover. I think if we believe in democracy as the rule of the ordinary citizen, we have to accept and bite the bullet that this is going to be the rule of the amateur, and that all the professionals have to be surrounding the process, informing it, helping along, but not making the decision and calling the shots for the ordinary citizens. Transparency, finally, institutionalization of the principle of light is the best disinfectant. Again, very commonsensical idea. I don't think it means everything should be transparent at all times, that there are certainly caveats and limitations, but as a default principle, it seems to me a very sound one, a very democratic one. So these are the 6 institutional principles. The main institutional recommendation I would make is that of the open mini-public. I'm happy to explain what I mean by that. It's basically a randomly selected public of a few hundred people, open, not closed, unlike Arash proposal, to the larger public, connected to it through crowdsourcing and deliberative platforms, connected down the line to referenda, and network with other communities. How do we get from here to there? A lot of options, hybrid assemblies, bicameralism, various levels of application. And finally, and this is the only thing I'll say about the global dimension of this project, and I'll say the least because I haven't really given enough thought at this point, is that all of that probably should be combined in the 7th principle, what I call dynamic inclusiveness, where the definition of the demos should be pluralized, made more fluid, perhaps adjusted to the type of questions that are at stake, and basically connected to some kind of principle of affected interest or subjected interest or some other notion that sort of expand the boundaries of the demos. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Terrific. I'm going to try to keep really short so we can have a more open discussion and a more general discussion. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Karina Mantana. I teach political science here at Yale. So I just want to make 3 quick points or 3 ideas about what democracy in the global age in terms of the question of the globe, and then 3 quick questions to each of the speakers. So obviously, one way we can think of democracy in the global age is something that John Keane has talked about is, democracies across the world are confronting problems at a global scale, and the environment is probably one, if not many, and maybe many more, and capitalism might be another. So there's a sense of globality there. The other, we've heard more about, in fact, in the last session, about globalization. and the anxieties and opportunities of democracy in an interconnected world that's increasingly interconnected, maybe non-territorial in some form, and really challenges some, as does the environment, as John pointed out, really challenges some basic territorial imagination and demographic imagination of traditional understandings of democracy and popular sovereignty. But I want to just make 2 points about a third that has come up, I think, in the background, which is what are the lessons to be learned through the global adoption of democracy, or the experience of democracy in other parts of the world outside of the West. Again, a point that's come up in a few presentations, and I think I want to just, and the term that I think Yves started us off with, and now that's appeared in many discussions around the world about provincializing our North American or North Atlantic concept of democracy. So I want to just say 2 things about what the theoretical consequences of that might be, or what it would look like. And I think there are 2 ways of understanding it. One is, of course, a strong sense that provincializing the West means that one has to recognize that democracy, as Sue Stokes says, has been a part of it. Many countries, Latin America one, India, others, have had generational experience of democracy now, and it's no longer a, it would be a mistake to call it a Western export in some way. These are cultures that have adopted and not just appropriated, but inhabit a democratic order. And so, of course, in one sense, our way of understanding their experience has to move out of a norm, deviation, or difference model. But I think one answer is then we have to take seriously the historical specificity of those democratic experiences, that that they're sequencing the relationship between universal suffrage, capitalism, other historical processes happen in different orders, and there's a specificity of context. There's a deep context. And I think all of that is important, but I do think that's not the only way to think of what the theoretical relevance of provincialization might be. And I just want to put out the sense of another that I think we should be taking more seriously than we have, which is that the fact that democracy, as we know, we've had more than just we've had a global experience of democracy for over 2,000 years. So there's been experiments in democracy from a very long time that we can take as comparative cases of understanding the internal and, we might say, chronic conditions of democracy. And so to me, it seems that really the importance of thinking of democracy in the global age is that, for example, and I'll give 3 or 4, that the way democracy has been practiced outside of the West may actually show us more deeper, continuing truths about the way democratic processes work. So not just as deviations, but in fact things and maybe chronic conditions of democracy that have been papered over by our focus on, as many people say, a mid-20th century version. So one quick example is, of course, many people had hope, and I think still do, that universal suffrage democracy would bring with it radical redistribution. And we know that if you take the experience of India, that has clearly shown not to be the case. So it might not mean that we give up that hope, but it does mean that one has to be much more sensitive to the chronic or internal reasons why democratic politics might be plutocratic in some form. That maybe should be our, at least from a critical perspective, something to watch out for, and not understood as an external or a deviation or something to be expunged. And I think that, so I would say I want to think about the question of crisis, as Hélène meant too, that some of these crises, especially when viewed from different places, may be revealing chronic conditions that one has to be more open to. And I'll just mention a couple of quick other ones, which I think looking at democracy from outside of the West will tell us is one, of course, as you know, voter turnout is radically different in many different parts. And our expectation has always been, and I remember an Almond and Verba classic study in the 1960s that always said, you don't want a high voter turnout. The middle voter turnout is the best. And that was just, that's just the rate of American turnout. It's naturally the best. And so,
that's funny.
And there is something, so of course, as you know, in India and in South Africa, voter turnout is on the rise, and also just things from the Western perspective which seem so unusual. Of course, more poorer people vote more, women vote more, more rural people vote more. In India, of course, voter turnout is highest at the local level, much higher than at the national level. And of course, that's the exact opposite of municipal elections in America. And the question is, maybe we should, in different ways, take that to be the norm and then think more carefully about why a country like America, which has really important local decentralization, has such a radically decreasing line of voting. So that's one. I think the other that I'll just mention, because I think it's come up, is, so I think we'll take Sue Stokes' point that I think alienation, or the crisis that we've been focusing on in some sense, is a Western crisis. Just the example of voter turnout is not consistent. The decline in voter turnout is not consistent across the globe, and so the basic problem of voter absenteeism isn't a problem, a common problem. But one thing that does seem to be a common problem is an anxiety about politics of identity. And I think here too, we have a tendency, especially, to think of that problem as one about tribal identities, a kind of primitivism, a kind of pre-modern or something, and we tend to think of that as sociological or cultural or historical facts that exist or pre-exist outside of democratic processes. But I think as many people, it might be helpful to think of the politicization of identity as something internal, there is something about democratic competition, there's something about the nature of aggregation, there's something about the nature of majoritarian thinking that will always, we might say, ignite group identities, use them, both dangerous ways, but also with opportunities. And it's not something that you can, the temptations of nativism will always be there. They might be an internal dynamic. And again, as a former colleague, and now a colleague of John McCormick's, Dimi Kasimis' new book on Athens tells us, the other main exclusion in Athens was the Medic. Athens was a blood-based kinship citizenship. So the temptations of nativism are at the roots of democratic theory that we don't really think through what kinship, birthright, why these ascriptive categories don't just pre-exist, but are produced by democratic politics. So I'm going to stop, that's my soapbox, and I'll stop. And I just will ask 3 quick questions to the 3 really wonderful papers. So I'll just start with Archon and just say, really, I thought this was a very important and interesting paper, and I really liked, I think it's a deep question that political theorists haven't thought about, which is political action from below. And you can think Michael Walzer's is the last book, really, that focused on the strategic question, and he wrote that as an activist, not as a theorist. So I really commend it. I think it's really important, but I think I just have a question about why, there is a social movements literature that pre-existed this, and I know you have engaged with it, that talks about opportunity structures and resources. And I guess I just wanted to hear more about why you think the power model is more useful than these older sociological model. And then the other question I wanted to ask is, between the 4 levels or the power levels, I wonder if I wanted to ask a little bit more about how you think the conflict between those levels might be. So there's definitely some question of strategic choice, but maybe in some of the examples you gave too, there may be dangers of trying to link up all those levels at once. So you might be more strategically successful at the everyday level if you don't politicize to the 4th level. So I was just curious if you had some sense of that. And to Hélène, and I think it'll sort of lean over into John's paper since John changed his paper. So I'm just going to ask, I think both of them in different ways are, and as we started out in this conference, on the one hand ask us, I think, to think very, and I like this, really tell us that we have to think much more creatively, we have to experiment. So Hélène, and I think some of the other papers we've heard, really, I think I'm really taken with the idea that innovation, new models of participation are both possible and necessary, and I really am open to the encouragement of all of them. But I do wonder if there is, I do wonder if we've got the right critique of representative democracy, because it seems to me that the Madison quote that we've shown more than once, there's 2 aspects of it, which is the permanent exclusion of the people, but also this other notion of the people in their collective capacity. And it does seem to me that Hélène's model right now has a lot of dispersion. You know, there's a lot of overlapping, open, tons of little mini publics. As our advisor might say, that sounds a lot like virtual representation in the 18th century, or representation in the Ancien regime. So proliferation and dispersion is not naturally democratic, or if it is, you have to give a different account. And it does seem to me that collective capacity is a part of our modern tradition of universal suffrage and voting, and I understand the denigration or the anxiety, but again, coming from India, people are, this is the way most people will participate in politics. People celebrate it, and maybe we all ought to think about how to shore up or make that vote more meaningful, rather than ignore it in favor of something that can never really quite create collective capacity. So I think that's, and John, I think that's I think the story of the global and the intergenerational and the new temporal dimension, these do, and you're absolutely right on the anthropocentric nature of democratic politics and about power. So I wonder though, I think it's a real challenge, but I think if we change the territorial and spatial assumptions or temporal assumption, I do wonder what the meaning of democracy would mean. Again, not just the collective capacity of the people in the traditional way was not just, it was the collective capacity in one moment. I mean, it's the assembly in Athens, you know, where people, there is a kind of temporal sense of these people at this moment made this decision. And if you include others who are virtually represented, again, you get back to the question of virtual representation versus real representation. So I'll end there and open it up. So I think maybe we'll just start by opening it up to questions and comments, and I'll take a list. So I have Melissa.
Thanks so much. This question is for Hélène. So you provide this really wonderful array of potential alternative mechanisms. I was intrigued by your stated rejection of direct democracy as infeasible, and what I saw as your attachment to the language of representation, complex representation. So this just posed a few questions for me. What in your mind makes these mechanisms representative? For instance, you refer to referendums, and I'm not sure what that's supposed to, what the language of representation, even complex representation, is supposed to pick out about a referendum that makes it representative rather than direct. And a way of getting at this a little bit more conceptually is, what are the deficiencies in your mind of electoral representation that this is supposed to remedy? If it's inegalitarianism, well, you talk about majority rule and deliberation. We could reform electoral institutions to make them more egalitarian. Or is it citizen disengagement, in which case, is there this sort of pent-up demand for participation that can't be satisfied, and this is picking up on Karuna's point, via some sort of increased focus on suffrage rather than this alternative set of institutions? Though, like I say, I'm intrigued by them.
Okay, so let's take two more, and Clarissa and Jeff, and then I'll take another one.
So I have three comments. The first for Hélène. I agree very much with Melissa in many regards, but I want to bring your attention to the principle of rotation, which is something that was put forward in the 18th century as a solution to corruption. However, rotation means more campaigns and more money into politics. So today, I don't know if it's something that could be, maybe today supposedly it works, but it doesn't. So I don't know if it's going to be a principle for open democracy in this way. Sometimes governments, representative governments that have lasted 10 years actually have done very well in a way. So rotation is not necessarily, as I see it, at least as a principle of democracy that it works today. Then for John, I was very intrigued by the equality between the biome and the anthropocentric democracy. And I wanted to suggest, what about thinking about an embedded democracy, a la Polanyi, but in politics? In a way, of course, we cannot not pursue our human needs and ends, but it has to be embedded in the environment and not only profiting from it. I don't know if that makes sense. And for Archon, I wanted to point to kind of a fussiness that I saw in the structural power. That you talk about the policy power as being law and policy, But it seems that the policy power is more kind of something specific about interest, something more minute, and structural power has to do more with rules and procedures, with the rules of the game, if you will. And therefore, kind of, you put money and leverage. Maybe it would also kind of the constitutional aspect of structural power. I suggest.
So we'll take a question from Jeff and then collect more.
Hi, my question is for Archon. Thank you very much, all of you, for your papers. I think the question, Archon, that you're dealing with about how, in the situation we're in, where there's so many problems and a scarce amount of reformist energy, how to direct ourselves, is a very useful contribution. But I would just like to hear you, if possible, say a little bit more about the conclusions you're making, because the conclusion I heard you make in your presentation seemed to be a little bit different or more reduced from some of the conclusions that come from the actual paper.
Sure.
You highlighted whether we should privilege level 2 or level 3, and you said we should privilege level 3. But I took you in the paper to be also insisting upon the essential criterion of level 1 as how we should measure progress.
Yeah.
And so, if relevant to you, I would like to hear more about that.
Yeah.
So do you want to start, Archon?
Sure, great.
Go this way.
Thank you very much. So just to the definitional issue, it is the terminologically confusing. Level 2 is, what I mean is covering laws and policies. That is, laws and policies that cover groups of people to confer some benefit or protection or take it away, right? So it's supposed to be very logically related to level 1 in that way. And then I guess there's two different things going on. One is, I think, ultimately, you measure the success of these organizations at level 1. Does the immigrant get to stay in the country, or does she have to leave? Does the kid have to go into the special ed program or go to a decent school? Does the the low-income renter get to stay in the house, right? That's the ultimate measure of success or failure for these groups, and I think for lots and lots of efforts. But that's a different question of where to direct strategic energy and attention. And so mine is a contingent diagnosis, which a lot of these groups seems to resonate with a lot of these groups, is that they have directed almost all of their attention to level 2, not much to level 1, and not much to level 3 outside of the labor movement. The labor movement historically has been very good at level 3, but there's not much labor movement left. And then that kind of goes to the resource mobilization. And those social movement theories are designed to explain when social movements happen and when they don't, right? These people don't have the luxury of, they're not interested in their existence being explained or explained away. They're interested in how to grow or not. And so this is an account of what they can do to open up resources and possibilities and influence. That's one difference. And then the second difference is it's more, there's a component that's more about governing, right? That's the seat at the table, that's the leverage, that's the direct influence on outcomes at level 1, which is different from the theory, a lot of it.
Thank you. So first to Kara's question about the diffuse or decentralized interpretation you have of my sort of model. Actually, in my mind, it's kind of the opposite. It might actually be decentralized. I have a sort of Rousseauian vision of one central assembly selected by lot, which would have like potentially legislative functions, and from which all other kinds of republics and electoral assemblies or self-selected groups, etc., would emanate, would get their authority from. So it's actually perhaps too Rousseauian. Maybe I should think of like a bicameral model or something. But it's true, you could also envision a completely diffuse, decentralized network of mini publics that are more or less all competing for the claim to represent the people, etc. And that's kind of not my preference, because I find like the diffusion of sovereignty very confusing and usually very undemocratic. But I don't have a clear picture myself of what this should look like. So I'm really working at the level of just above of the principles that I think are democratic. Then, in terms of the direct democracy question, I don't like the vocabulary of direct versus representative democracy. I find it extremely confusing, in part because it's too easy to dismiss the ancient Athens example as, it's direct. No, it wasn't. I mean, maybe it wasn't direct. I mean, there were open moments when people could working in the public space, and there were like representative, also open moments when you are selected by lot. So I think I'm tempted to move away from this dichotomy, direct and representative, for something different, like closed, open, differently representative, etc. Referenda, it's true. In theory, it's direct, but only a fraction of the people vote. So in the end, they end up speaking for the people who don't show up. So is that representation? Maybe not. But when you're talking about a citizens' initiative where 2% of the population put something on the agenda, this is not direct democracy for me. There's an element of mass that I associate with direct democracy that just doesn't map onto my intuitions at least. Then about rotation, to Camilla. Sure, I'm sure rotation will have problems, but right now what we have is elected representatives that stay in power forever with a turnover rate of 9% in the US. You get 9% of approval and zero correlation between public policies and majoritarian preference in the US when you control for the preferences of the 10 wealthiest person. So it's just a trade-off between bad and worse, and I think it would just be probably better off with more rotation. And you can scale it differently. It could be 5 years, 5 months, I'm not sure. A lot of experiments is needed. And then the problems with the electoral representation that Melissa was pressing me on, what's wrong with it specifically? Well, I think there's a deficit of democratic legitimacy once you accept that the legitimacy is not just about consent. Like it's not descriptively tracking the diversity of interest in the population. And so if you believe that that's a part of a democratic legitimacy, then it's failing that, and it needs to be complemented by something else, if not replaced.
Gosh, thank you very much. I have three quickly things to say. One, an opening remark to Karuna about, I don't like speaking about truths of democracy, but I think if, let me just put it bluntly, if Tocqueville were alive today, he would probably come to the Asia-Pacific region, very broadly defined, where he would ruminate on the transformations that have been affected in the spirit and the language and the institutional dynamics of democracy. India, I've tried to write about it, you are working on it with Satyagraha and so on. India is full of experiments that have had and ought to be registered in the way we think about democracy. Think of the Indian understanding of what secularism is. It is not French understanding, it is not the British understanding, it's not the American understanding, and it's very much under assault. India is full of, I would say, monetary mechanisms, fiercely fought student elections, railway courts run Mumbai, and so on. And there are many other interesting things. This is a region that's a laboratory. The Taiwanese showed that you do not have to have a sovereign territorial state to have a power-sharing constitutional democracy. But then there are the darker sides. Thailand shows what happens when populism takes root in the middle classes and a kind of democide happens. And of course, there is the great question of China that Tocqueville would have, I'm sure, many things to say about. But this is one remark. Second, is it Camilla who asked me about embedded democracy? I think it's a very interesting idea, and it's a redescription of what I was trying to say. Karl Polanyi, of course, is blind to the environmental question. When he speaks about the critique of neoliberal, the market fantasy, he wants to say that no market can produce human beings. It cannot nurture, it cannot give birth to children, it cannot nurture children, it cannot teach their things, and so on. That point remains fundamentally important. I, in this forthcoming book, give this a twist by trying to write, I know no other literature, on the history of energy regimes and changing historical forms of democracy. The story, roughly, is that the assembly democracies of the Greek world were basically embedded in muscle power, slavery, with a touch of wind power and horsepower and mule power. A few historians are beginning to see that the invention of representative democracy, the word the Greeks had no word for representation. They may have practiced it, but they didn't have an understanding in the sense that crystallized in the last quarter of the 18th century. Very few people have observed that another revolution took place at the same time, which is the switch to carbon-based energy regimes. And I would say, to cut a very long story short, that one of the most interesting things about the greening of politics is that it belongs to, I would say, an epochal shift in the spirit and the language and institutions of democracy. I call it monitory democracy. I think it began to happen in the 1940s. It's not finished. It has no a guarantee of survival. But there is a struggle going on to transform the energy regime on which democratic power sharing, the prevention of the abuse of arbitrary power, that struggle is unfinished, but it's going on, and it's not just solar panels. It's, I would say, thirdly, it also affects deeply our sense of temporality. I would say that, again, thinking in terms of these three phases of democracy, the assembly democracies, maybe up to 100 of them in the Greek world, were caught up in a world of deities. They weren't secular in say, the French sense. And there was a certain cyclical presumption that time is cyclical and that degeneration sets in. Democracy is replaced by tyranny and so on. We now know that representative democracy, as it was born at the end of the 18th century, at certain points fell in love with the whole teleological notion of progress, of modern progress. So much so that Reinhold Niebuhr, in the midst of World War II, complained bitterly about this and said it's one of the follies of representative democracy. We need to rethink Democrats' sense of time. I would say, again, to put it very simply, that one of the things that's going on in this age of monitory democracy is a pluralization of rhythms. It's not only that we're aware of the dangers of blind belief in progress, but and it's not only that we're aware of the existential temporality of our human bodies, but we are beginning to, publics are beginning to understand the importance of future generations, thinking in a Burkean sense about the rights of the unborn, and also the very fundamental importance of deep time. Of deep time, this is, it's been brewing for a while, and Darwin and others are part of this, but this sense that we are a mere touch of the nose in a stretch of time that is as tall as the body. So you may object that this makes life bloody complicated. The question is whether democracies can cultivate a plurality of rhythms. I happen to think it's a good thing, in fact. It makes life more complex, but it's one of the areas, I think, in which political thinking hasn't really delved deeply enough. These are three opening points.
Great. So, Rebecca, right? Sorry. Is it Rebecca? No.
Oh,
Samantha, sorry. I apologize.
Hi, my question is for Professor Landemore. So I found your 6 or 7 principles to be incredibly compelling, but I guess I'm curious about how the final decision-making sovereign authority plays out in terms of promoting this principle. So it seems to me that there's at least some tension between the degree of openness in actual governmental decisions as opposed to merely open channels for consultation, and the degree to which the government can be subject to simple majoritarian rule as opposed to subject to the powers of blocking minority vetoes. So on the one hand, you have a government like the British Westminster system, where there's a single body that has all of the decisional authority. And in fact, in the UK, they have a mass channel for government input where I believe anyone can get 200,000 or 500,000 people to sign a petition, they will have a debate in Parliament about it, but then they simply ignore whatever comes of that debate and do it in a very holistic fashion. On the other hand, if you have government arranged in the way that the United States are, where there are maybe 5 or 6 different veto points, then you can have fairly small blocking minorities. But you could imagine that one of those veto points could be a mini public or one of the other more open channels. So I guess I'm just wondering, given that it does seem like your principles imply that multiple bodies that exercise government, how would you, what sort of vision for the final decisional authority ought to rest, given concerns?
I think brains
Yeah, this is a question to Archon. I was just wondering to which extent your account of power is analytical and to which extent it is normative. It seems to me that you are trying to develop an analytical account. In this way, you are still similar to Dux. But most of the examples that you give, from a normative perspective, seem to be something like counter-domination examples. But of course, if you take a normative framework at its version of domination theory, then this is where your illustrations come from. But your account should theoretically work just as well for power that is dominating, rather than liberating. Exactly the same types of levels would apply if you want to really reinforce your dominating power.
Yeah.
Would you be entirely agnostic, or is there anything that informs your normative choice of examples, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the last question will be Armando's.
Thank you. Just two empirical things. One is about Mexico and unions. If you look in the 80s, Mexico was highly unionized and extremely unequal, so it's not as impossible as it seems. The government actually created the unions. They were called sindicatos. Some of them still survive, like the teachers. And the other one, actually in defense of Hélène, the Roman Republic, especially the late Roman Republic, they have rotation almost of their offices for 1 year, and they control a vast amount of territory. So you can have a humongous, it was borderline empire, it was becoming an empire, but a humongous entity that has extremely fast rotation on the top.
Terrific. So we'll have our last comments. We'll start at that end. John, is there anything you want to say, or should we?
I've got 2 things briefly to say now.
You can say them very briefly.
I know we're all going to we're going to dream democracy tonight, I'm sure. I think it's implicit in Hélène and Archon's contributions, but we've rather beaten around the bush, I think, about the ultimate normative question, bundle of questions about why democracy. What's so good about this form of life, this way of handling power? I've looked at and have tried to reconstruct something like a repertoire of the historical justifications for democracy, which is really shocking. Because what you find is that probably 90%, historically speaking, of the justifications are no longer plausible or outright absurd. Let me just mention a few. We have no great democratic theorists from the classical era of assembly democracy, but from the speeches and the fragments of poems and the plays, we know that the Athenians valued the democratia for military reasons. That it makes we Athenians militarily powerful as an empire. This is not workable. If you jump forward in time to the age of representative democracy and you look, for example, at the anti-slavery movements, the first great social movement of modern times, and you look for the Democrats, and you look at in their pamphlets at why they say democracy is a good thing, you will find the word God. If you scratch a little bit, you'll find Protestantism. That's very bad news for Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and Catholics. There was Mazzini's famous argument that every nation is entitled to have democracy because democracy is somehow historically foreordained for nations. We have John Stuart Mill through to Karl Popper's belief that truth is produced by the public disputations that only democracy enables. We have Sun Yat-sen's belief, rather Marxian, neo-Marxian belief that democracy is the final stage of history, Frank Fukuyama. The breakdown of those justifications is striking. In my life, I think consequentialism has principally been the way of trying to justify democracy, and increasingly or decreasingly are those consequentialist arguments persuasive. They're either tautological, democracy is good because it enables people to decide for themselves, but this is just to say democracy is good because democracy is good. Or that wealth is created thanks to democracy. Well, the Singaporeans, Rahul, I think, has gone, and the Chinese, of course, don't accept this. But I do think, and, oh, you are here. I do think, Hélène, in your remark that power corrupts is onto something very, very important, and I think it, in the 21st century, becomes, I would say, the universalist argument for why it is that the sharing and restraint, the sharing of power, the restraint of arbitrary power, which democracies do best, is something like a universal norm, and it's to do with the problem of risk and folly and hubris. And these are dangerous times, and there is mounting evidence that concentrated power, which is arbitrary, which is not restrained and subject to accountability, is dangerous power. And this, it seems to me, would be the most powerful reply to, and I have much sympathy, Rahul, for what you had to say earlier, but it is the most powerful and disturbing reply to Beijing and to Singapore. Okay. And they themselves worry their heads about it. This is very clear. One last remark, if I may.
Very quick.
About hope.
Really, hope is good. Hope is good. sorry. We're going to have to move on. Yes, we have to move on.
I won't speak about hope.
Great. Renee, you put your finger on the key question and problem. So I think there's a couple of different levels of answer. One answer is, if the norm is political equality, and what I'm looking at is organizations, I don't have an account of what an egalitarian pluralism would look like, in the sense that I think once these organizations kind of get going, they're always going to try to tilt the field in their favor, and I don't have an account at all about what a flat playing field looks like from that perspective, because I just think there are too many levers out there. Okay, so that's to say, at one level, no. Second level, kind of. So there was a famous kingmaker in the United States in the late 19th century named Mark Hanna. And he said, all my years in politics, I've learned three things that are important. The first thing is money, and I forget what the second and third is, right? And so, what this is about, the other thing that's important and about democracy, and hopefully more important than money, ideally, is people, right? And so the extent to which this has a normative bias is it's an analytic account of how organizations that are devoted to mobilizing more and more people and drawing them into politics and connecting them with politics can be more effective. So at the second kind of weaker normative level, the idea is to put a thumb in the scale for people, hopefully, and a little bit less on money.
Hélène gets the last word.
So to Sal's question about the competing legitimacy. So I agree that in theory it seems like an intractable problem, but in practice it's actually easier to solve if you look at concrete experiments. So in the Icelandic case, I didn't have time to talk about Iceland, but you can divide, you can basically do a division of labor. You get, say, the mini-public to do the agenda setting. You get the electoral assembly to do the deliberative function, but also you call it consultation. I think that's a weak version, but in deliberation with the larger public through crowdsourcing platform and deliberative platform, and when it's done well, it's very compelling. There's a big difference between the South African type of consultation in the constitutional process of the 80s, where they consulted but didn't listen, everything just made zero impact on the final constitutional product, and the Icelandic case, where 10% of the contribution online made a difference, causal difference to the textual output. And then you can have a final say by a referendum. So I'll tell you that, like in theory, it's going to be difficult to have a perfect theory of who does best, who does what best, like the mini public versus the elected assembly versus the referendum versus the initiatives. But I think we just have to experiment and see. And sometimes it's very surprising. The Irish case, hybrid assemblies, a hybrid constitutional convention with 66 randomly selected people mixed with 34 elected officials looks like very impure theoretically, like what was the legitimacy of something like that? Turns out it worked beautifully and they passed marriage equality. So, and then I just wanted to finish on this because we talked about Switzerland and it's bugged me since yesterday. By the way, about Switzerland, so we're told it's too small, it's irrelevant. It's always the counterpoint to these kind of examples. But it was the same thing in the 18th century. The Federalists said to the Anti-Federalists, stop bringing up Switzerland, this is not for us, they're too small, etc. Turns out they were about the same size. It was 3 million in the US, and yes, it was a bit smaller in Switzerland. From what I've looked, it looks like there were 2 million, but it's not that different. So if the US had built a truly Swiss-like democracy in the 18th century, where would we be today? I think it would look very different. And by the way, another point about the Swiss, which we should talk more about, is that it's always they're too homogeneous, and same thing about Iceland, they're too Christian homogeneous. But my belief, and I can't prove it, and I'd love to hear from empirical scientists if there's any evidence in that direction, is that democratic procedure can create value homogeneity. I have 2 data points. Iceland in the 9th century, when they were split in the middle between pagans and Christians, and they consensually decided to move all of them to Christian values. Okay. One small example, and then this guy, what's his name, John Francis Mercer in the 18th century pointed out that at the time when the rest of Europe under monarchies were tearing each other apart about religious differences between what we see now as very homogeneous sects, like Christian, Papists and Protestants. Well, Switzerland solved those disagreements through democratic procedure. So I just want to say that we shouldn't listen to people who tell us that small is irrelevant, homogeneous is irrelevant. Homogeneous might be a result of the democratic procedure, not a precondition for it. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, the last word I thought we'd also just say thank you again to Hélène and Sheila.
Wonderful facilitation.
It's a really great job. I couldn't absorb. I mean, I was really taken by it.
Oh, good.
So, very project.